Because of this, a lot of laymen try to claim this belief was borrowed from paganism. However, it is not supported by any New Testament scholarship, for the simple reason that pagans didn't believe it was possible to come back from death. From Homer to Plato, all ancient pagans knew one thing: death was a one-way street. Aeschylus said, "Once a man has died, and the dust has soaked up his blood, there is no resurrection." Callimachus wrote a dialogue of someone asking a soul in Hades if there was a way out. "O Charadias, what of the world below? Much darkness. And what of an upward way? A lie." In the Iliad and Odyssey, the theme is pretty obvious. Once you are dead, you stay dead. When Priam mourns the death of her son Hector, Achilles tells her, "Lamenting for your son will do you no good at all. You will be dead yourself before you bring him back to life." Later in the Odyssey, Odysseus journeys to the underworld and engages with dead spirits, but even though they want to, none of them have any hope of returning from the underworld. As soon as a spirit leaves the white bones, and the ghost, like a dream, flutters off and is gone. The world of ancient pagans was pretty depressing. There was no return from death, just a hopeless existence as a wandering spirit in the underworld. Later on, there is a bit of hope in the works of Pindar, Plato, and Cicero, who argued although the body would die, the soul was immortal and would leave this world for a better spiritual existence. There was in fact a heaven the pagans could hope for, but it was not a bodily resurrection. In fact, a bodily resurrection was something that would have disappointed them, who hoped for liberation from the physical and to be transformed into a spiritual existence. As N.T. Wright says, "Neither in Plato nor in the major alternatives just mentioned do we find any suggestion that resurrection, the return to bodily life of the dead person, was either desirable or possible." One of the few tales of a return to bodily life in the ancient pagan world can be seen when Hercules rescues Alcestis from the underworld. But this can hardly be interpreted as what the Christians believed in, which was an eternal physical existence. Alcestis could only be classified as a resuscitation, which is brought back to a mortal existence, and it is expected they will die again, whereas resurrection was more understood as coming back to life in a transformed, glorified body, and never dying again. And it was expected that Alcestis was only resuscitated, and would die like everyone else, and be trapped in the underworld eventually. Celsus and other pagan critics also dismissed these stories as impossible and mere fiction. Pagans did not take such stories seriously, nor make them their core doctrine. Resurrection and resuscitation were things to poke fun at, but not something they hoped for or thought was possible. And N.T. Wright addresses dozens of other pagan stories and authors in his book. Basically, you either followed Plato and didn't want a bodily resurrection, or you were a follower of the old ways in Homer and knew you would not get a body again. Even in Egypt, this was not something that was conceived to be possible. In Egypt, there was no eschatology, no apocalypse, no collective cataclysm, because there was no crisis. Death was life. In Egypt, death was just a continuation of life, not the end and the need for the hope of a bodily return. Death was just the next step of bodily life in the next world, but there was no return to this world. So like the rest of the pagan world, death was the end of the existence in this life, which is unlike what the Christians believed about their own future and what they had thought had already happened to Jesus. However, many laymen across the internet want to tell us Jesus was just copied off of pagan deities who were also physically resurrected. But this cannot be further from the truth, and this is why scholars do not take these theories as credible. Many of these pagan deities were not human who were physically resurrected, but were metaphorically resurrected along with the crop cycles or with the setting and the rising of the sun, like with Horus. Horus died every night, so to speak, and was resurrected in a sense when it rose. As N.T. Wright says, did any worshippers in these cults from Egypt to Norway at any time in antiquity think that actual human beings, having died, actually come back to life? Of course not. These multifarious and sophisticated cults enacted the god's death and resurrection as a metaphor, whose concrete referent was the cycle of seed time and harvest, of human reproduction and fertility. Stanley Porter says, bodily resurrection is not part of such cults and their beliefs. This pagan idea of gods dying and rising did not fit with the idea of how resurrection was actually defined in Christianity, that is, of a physical human body dying and coming back to life in a transformed, glorified body.